Howard Finkel, the golden voice of WWE, the man whose dulcet tones could make even a human dumpster fire sound like a conquering Roman emperor. But behind that angelic voice, a soul slowly dying every time he had to introduce yet another brainless muscle balloon, diva maniac, or human meth explosion. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Howard Finkel was a goddamn saint. He worked in an industry full of absolute lunatics, criminals, steroid monsters, and cocaine-fueled berserkers, and somehow managed to never strangle anyone on live pay-per-view. But just because Howard didn't say anything doesn't mean he wasn't thinking it. If you listened closely when he announced certain wrestlers' names, you could hear it. That half-second pause, like a man weighing up whether life imprisonment might actually be preferable. Ladies and gentlemen, for your amusement and historical education, I present the top 5 wrestlers Howard Finkel absolutely hated but still had to pretend. Where God's gift to wrestling and jokes are crueler than a WrestleMania payday for a mid-carder in 1993, let's get ready to despise some legends. If cocaine could grow legs and scream about destrucity, it would have been the ultimate warrior. Howard Finkel, a meticulous professional man who ironed his socks and alphabetized his soup cans, had to introduce a human fever dream wearing tassels and shrieking like a banshee trying to pass a kidney stone. And he hated it. According to multiple sources, including Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross, backstage folks, including Fink, couldn't stand how Warrior would constantly blow past his cues, ignore runtimes, forget promos, and change plans mid-match like a toddler high on sugar and lies. In a 2017 Something to Wrestle episode, Bruce Pritchard laughed that Howard Finkel once asked if we could just pre-tape Warrior's entrances to save everyone's blood pressure. Jim Ross, even more bluntly in a 2012 Ring Rust radio interview, said, Howard was a stickler for timing. Warrior treated time like it owed him money. Picture it. Fink, timing entrances down to the second like an orchestral conductor, only to have Warrior storm the stage early, sprint like a drunken gazelle, and nearly concuss a referee, all before Finkel could even finish saying, "from parts unknown." It was like trying to host the Oscars while someone set the stage on fire behind you. The Fink once muttered, allegedly, according to a former WWE producer, "By the time I finish saying Ultimate Warrior, he's already halfway to Idaho." But ever the professional, Finkel soldiered on, his soul dying slightly more every time he had to bellow, "Ultimate Warrior," while secretly wishing Warrior would Ultimate Warrior himself straight into a traffic cone. Imagine Frankenstein's monster, but if Frankenstein had dropped him on his head, Sid was everything Howard Finkel despised, unreliable, flaky, dumb as a bag of wet rocks, and convinced he was God's gift to wrestling. According to Jim Cornette, who had roughly the same amount of affection for Sid as one does for syphilis, Finkel found Sid's no-shows, ego, and blank stares infuriating. Sid famously walked out on the WWF in 1992 because softball season was starting. Softball. While Vince McMahon scrambled to find a new WrestleMania main event, Howard Finkel was reportedly heard muttering, "We should have just booked the softball team." Every time Fink had to announce him as the master and ruler of the world, it was like he was actively resisting the urge to add of the intellectually challenged. Bruce Pritchard even joked that Fink once called Sid the 8th wonder of the world, the 7th being a functional brain. Sid's promos were so bad that Howard Finkel, the man who invented the term WrestleMania, openly cringed. In fact, if you listen closely to Sid's iconic "Half the Brain You Do" promo, you can almost hear Howard in the background whispering, "Sweet Christ, get me a noose." Wrestling historians agree on 2 things about the Warlord. He looked like a final boss from a 1980s steroid factory. He had the promo ability of a speak and spell with brain damage. And Howard Finkel? Howard Finkel thought introducing Warlord was like announcing a meatloaf at a science fair. Warlord was so immobile by 1990 that wrestlers would plan matches around what angle he would fall down at. Bruce Pritchard once laughed that Howard used to pray the Warlord wouldn't trip just walking to the ring, because if he did fall, physics professors would have to be flown in from MIT to explain the impact crater. The Fink's frustration wasn't just Warlord's complete lack of charisma, it was the waste of it all. Howard loved performers who brought energy to a crowd. The Warlord brought silence. Vast, yawning, endless silence. It was like announcing a brick wall to the ring. In private, Howard was rumored to call Warlord's matches intermissions with flexing. One night after announcing, allegedly after a few Jack and Cokes, Fink muttered to a tech guy, "That man couldn't cut a promo if you gave him scissors and subtitles." If human confusion could be weaponized, it would look like Ahmed Johnson. Physically, the guy was a monster. Vocally, he sounded like someone trying to speak underwater during a seizure. Finkel absolutely dreaded announcing Ahmed Johnson, because 9 times out of 10, Ahmed would forget his cue, storm the ramp early, or start cutting a promo into the wrong camera. Bruce Pritchard said in 2020, Howard Finkel kept Ahmed's intro short for a reason. The less time he had to be near him, the better. There's a famous story that once Ahmed got so confused backstage that he entered through the wrong curtain, wandered into catering, and started cutting a promo at a tray of lasagna. Howard Finkel had to chase him down like a disoriented grandparent at Walmart. Every time Howard roared, "Ahmed Johnson," he looked like a man trying to summon a demon and realizing it had already eaten his dog. In private, Fink reportedly called Ahmed the human typo. Lex Luger. Proof that you can have the body of a Greek god and the personality of a DMV clerk. Howard Finkel loathed announcing Lex Luger. Why? Because Lex Luger carried himself backstage like he was Elvis and the Pope rolled into one, but performed like a potato with abs. In Death of WCW, it's noted that Luger's backstage attitude was lazy, arrogant, and so aloof he needed a seeing eye dog just to find his own matches. Jim Cornette once called Luger a human mannequin with the charisma of sawdust. And poor Howard Finkel, the man who had introduced legends with passion and pride, had to pretend Luger was the second coming of Hulk Hogan, while watching him bungle promos, sandbag opponents, and half-ass his way through some of the worst main events of the 90s. Bruce Pritchard said on his podcast, Howard knew how to sell excitement. Luger made that harder than trying to sell an inflatable dartboard. There's a persistent story that once, after a particularly atrocious Luger match, Finkel was heard backstage growling, "We should have announced the ring ropes. They did more work." Howard Finkel was a god among men, a pristine, velvet-voiced prophet trapped in the swirling insanity of 1980s and 90s professional wrestling. If WWE was the Roman Empire, Howard was the poor scholar chained to a pillar forced to recite poetry while the gladiators set themselves on fire. But no matter how hard the industry tried to break him, Howard stayed a professional. Even when the Ultimate Warrior galloped to the ring like a caffeinated kangaroo, even when Sid forgot where he was mid-sentence, even when Ahmed Johnson cut promos that sounded like a blender full of gravel, Howard soldiered on. And that, dear viewer, is a level of professionalism not seen since the Titanic band played through the iceberg. The 5 wrestlers we covered today weren't just bad at their jobs. They were living, breathing arguments against optimism. Every one of them tested Howard Finkel's patience harder than a malfunctioning self-checkout machine at 11 p.m. They weren't just wrestlers. They were walking anxiety attacks dressed in spandex. You could see it in Howard's face sometimes, a tiny flicker, the haunted 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much. A man who had announced Bruno Sammartino and now had to announce a sentient pair of steroid-inflated shoulder pads, Warlord, without setting himself on fire out of protest. And the worst part? Howard made them all sound like gods anyway, because Howard Finkel was wrestling's greatest illusionist. He could take a charisma vacuum like Lex Luger and make him sound like the second coming of Christ's personal trainer. Howard Finkel, the voice of wrestling, the soul of wrestling, the poor bastard who had to announce Lex Luger like it meant something. We salute you, Fink, and if there's any justice in the afterlife, you're up there right now, introducing angels into the ring, timing them perfectly. While Warrior is off somewhere in cosmic catering, still trying to explain distrucity to a confused sandwich. Rest in peace, Howard. You were too good for this business, and frankly, too good for most of the people you had to announce. Thanks for watching.